The night I realized my stepmother was trying to steal my dying father's estate. I was standing in a hospice hallway holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Interesting thing about betrayal. Sometimes it arrives quietly enough that your body hears it before your brain does. The door to my father's hospice room stood open about 4 inches. Just enough for voices to slip through. Soft light spilled into the hallway. An 4 pump ticked steadily somewhere inside. And above the bed, a tiny red camera light blinked once every few seconds. Watching. Recording. Waiting. Interesting, honestly. Because the people trying hardest to control a story rarely notice who else is listening. Then I heard my stepmother whisper. Just sign. Pause. She'll fight you forever over nothing. I stopped moving immediately. Coffee halfway to my mouth. Breathing gone shallow. And then came the sentence I still hear in my sleep sometimes. I'm the one who stayed. Interesting thing about certain sentences. They divide your life cleanly into before and after. My father was dying. 68 hours from the end. Morphine drifting through his veins. Barely strong enough to lift one hand from the blanket. And the woman he trusted most was trying to slide paperwork beneath his fingers before he disappeared completely. I did not scream. Did not storm into the room. Did not throw the coffee. Interesting, honestly. Because people who work around legal disasters learn early that panic destroys evidence faster than almost anything else. My name is Frances Wheeler. 34 years old. Probate paralegal. Denver, Colorado. My specialty is inheritance litigation. Which sounds sophisticated until you translate it honestly. I help organize wars families start after funerals. Interesting thing about my profession. You spend enough years watching strangers destroy each other over money. Eventually you believe you'll recognize the signs inside your own family early enough to stop it. You won't. Not when love is involved. Not when guilt is involved. Definitely not when the person manipulating everyone has spent years rehearsing the role of devoted caregiver first. My father's name was Raymond Wheeler. Contractor. Builder. One truck in 1978. A regional supply company by 60. Hands permanently rough from drywall dust and winters spent loading materials himself because he trusted labor more than management. Interesting, honestly. Because men who build things physically often believe they can repair people emotionally the exact same way. My mother died when I was 19. Sudden aneurysm. One normal Tuesday. Gone by Thursday morning. After that, Dad and I became the kind of small quiet family that survives mostly through routine. Phone calls on Sundays. Oil changes together during holidays. Long conversations about absolutely nothing important. Interesting thing about quiet fathers. They often love you most in the spaces where words barely appear at all. He called me Franny. Always. Never Francis unless he was reading paperwork. And he had one sentence he repeated constantly. About tools. About money. About trust. I put things where they belong, Franny. Interesting, honestly. Because careful people spend entire lifetimes organizing protection quietly before anyone realizes they're doing it. For years before the hallway, I moved to Denver for work. Better salary. Bigger firm. Higher ceilings. Longer hours. The kind of opportunity you celebrate publicly while privately wondering what relationships you're trading for it. Dad pretended he wasn't disappointed. That somehow hurt worse. We'll do holidays, he said. I promised every holiday. I made about half. Interesting thing about adult children. We always believe there will be more time later for the conversations we postponed today. Then came Diane. Dental office manager. Divorced. Precise. Efficient. The kind of woman who alphabetized spice racks and folded grocery bags into matching squares. My father admired organization because his whole life had been controlled chaos. And honestly, at first I liked her too. Interesting thing about dangerous people. They almost never arrive looking dangerous initially. She drove him to appointments. Packed medication boxes. Handled insurance calls. Learned every doctor's schedule by memory. When Dad got sick, she became indispensable. That's the word that matters. Indispensable. Interesting, honestly. Because dependency is where control quietly starts growing roots. The diagnosis was pancreatic cancer. Aggressive. 14 months from discovery to hospice. For the first year, Dad still sounded like himself. Tired. But himself. Then something shifted slowly. Calls started going unanswered. Texts came back shorter. Whenever I reached him, Diane appeared within minutes. He needs rest. Doctor said no stress. Don't exhaust him. All reasonable sentences. That's what makes isolation so effective. Interesting thing about manipulation. It works best when every individual excuse sounds compassionate by itself. I told myself she was protecting him. I told myself guilt was making me paranoid. I told myself long-distance daughters don't get to criticize wives carrying the real burden daily. Interesting, honestly. Because sometimes intelligence simply gives people more sophisticated ways to ignore their instincts. Then the phone stopped reaching him almost completely. Diane answered from his number instead. Every time. I'll tell him you called. I started saying I wanted to visit. Suddenly there were complications. Bad weeks. Procedures. Infections. No visitors right now. Interesting thing about family gatekeepers. They gradually replace direct relationships with controlled access until nobody notices the switch happening. By hospice. I hadn't spoken to my father properly in nearly 2 months. I didn't know how thin he'd become. Didn't know he'd stopped reading. Didn't know the phone beside his bed had been moved physically out of reach. What I also didn't know was that a hospice nurse named Carol Bishop had started noticing things too. Carol had 19 years of end-of-life experience. Which meant she understood something most families don't. Real grief feels chaotic. Real love feels messy. What worried her about Diane felt neither messy nor chaotic. It felt organized. Interesting, honestly. Because predatory behavior becomes terrifying specifically when it starts looking efficient. Visitors got intercepted at the door. Paperwork appeared constantly. Folders with colored sign here tabs. A son named Garrett whispering in hallways every evening. And my father. Turning his face away from documents while morphine blurred his words together. One afternoon Carol heard him whisper only one thing during a conversation about paperwork. Franny. Just my name. Like a drowning person reaching upward. Interesting thing about nurses. The good ones notice emotional bruises the same way they notice physical ones. That night, Carol checked his emergency contacts. Diane listed first. Me second. In my father's own handwriting. A Denver number nobody had bothered calling. Interesting, honestly. Because isolation only works while everyone around it keeps cooperating quietly. Carol copied my number onto the back of her hand in blue pen. Waited 2 days. Then called me at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday night. Francis Wheeler? Her voice sounded careful. Controlled. The kind of tone medical professionals use when reality is already worse than the person answering the phone understands yet. Yes. Small pause. I'm a hospice nurse caring for your father. And honestly? My stomach already knew before the rest of me caught up. He's asking for you. Silence. Then quietly. There are documents here. Another pause. I don't think he understands what he's signing. Interesting thing about fear. Sometimes it doesn't feel emotional at all. Sometimes it feels administrative. My brain instantly began building legal checklists automatically. Undue influence. Diminished capacity. Confidential relationship. Coercion. Every probate red flag I spent 10 years documenting professionally. Suddenly sitting around my own dying father's bed. I packed in under 7 minutes. Laptop. Phone charger. Black suit. Nothing else mattered. Interesting, honestly. Because emergencies reduce human beings into priorities unbelievably fast. I drove 14 straight hours through darkness toward Ohio. Stopped once for gas. Bought coffee I never drank. The entire drive. I kept telling myself Diane was probably overwhelmed. Probably scared. Probably grieving already. I kept searching desperately for innocent explanations because daughters do that long after evidence begins stacking against people they love. Interesting thing about hope. Sometimes it survives purely because the alternative hurts too much to accept yet. Then I reached the hospice just after 11 the next night. Bought another coffee from the lobby. Walked down a pale hallway toward room 214. And heard her whisper. Just sign. The coffee went cold in my hand while my entire family changed forever. The drive from Denver to Ohio took 14 hours. Interesting thing about panic. If you hold it in long enough, it eventually transforms into procedure. I drove through Kansas darkness with my hands locked at 10 and 2 like I was taking a driving test instead of racing toward my dying father. Truck stops. Gas stations. Cold highway lights smearing across the windshield. And the entire time, my legal brain kept building timelines automatically. Interesting, honestly. Because once you spend enough years inside probate litigation, you stop hearing family emergency and start hearing evidence preservation. Power of attorney. Confidential relationship. Capacity concerns. Isolation. Undue influence. Every red flag my career trained me to recognize professionally. Suddenly wearing my father's face. I hated myself for thinking that way. Interesting thing about guilt. It survives even after facts begin arriving. I kept searching for innocent explanations. Maybe Diane was overwhelmed. Maybe Carol misunderstood. Maybe paperwork around hospice care only looked suspicious because my job poisoned me toward worst-case scenarios. Interesting, honestly. Because daughters do not want their instincts to be right when the truth involves betrayal. The hospice parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived. 11:07 p.m. Light rain. 3 glowing windows on the 3rd floor. I sat inside the rental car for almost a full minute before moving. Not because I was afraid of seeing my father. Because some part of me already understood I was about to walk into a completely different version of my family. Interesting thing about life-changing moments. Your body often slows down right before them automatically. The lobby smelled like disinfectant and weak coffee. Artificial lemon mixed with sickness. A television murmured weather forecasts to nobody. At the front desk, a nurse with silver glasses looked up immediately. Frances Wheeler? Carol. Older than I imagined. Gray streak through dark hair. The kind of face that looked trustworthy instantly because exhaustion had burned all performance out of it years ago. Interesting, honestly. Because people working around death professionally stop wasting energy pretending eventually. She touched my arm gently. You made good time. How is he? Tiny pause. He's waiting. Not stable. Not resting. Waiting. Interesting thing about hospice nurses. They learn how to tell the truth without destroying people all at once. Carol walked beside me quietly down the hallway. Soft shoes against pale tile. Machines humming faintly behind closed doors. And halfway there, she stopped. There's something else. I looked at her immediately. She's been pushing documents. No name needed. I already knew who she meant. She brought in a lawyer yesterday. Interesting, honestly. Because suddenly my fear stopped feeling paranoid and started feeling late. What kind of documents? Carol hesitated carefully. I didn't read them. Pause. But they weren't medical. Another pause. And your father looked distressed every time they appeared. Distressed. Not confused. Not agitated. Distressed. Huge difference. Interesting thing about medical language. Good nurses choose words the way lawyers choose evidence. Then she said something that changed everything. There's a camera in the room. I frowned. A camera? Motion monitor. Pause. It records continuously. Interesting, honestly. Because sometimes truth survives only because somebody forgets to turn something off. We reached room 214. Door cracked open 4 inches. Warm light spilling softly into the hallway. And through the opening? I heard Diane whisper. Just sign. The same sentence. Calm. Practiced. Like she'd already repeated it 20 times before I arrived. Interesting thing about rehearsed manipulation. Eventually it starts sounding administrative instead of emotional. She'll fight you forever over nothing. My hand froze against the door. Then. I'm the one who stayed. Interesting, honestly. Because people trying hardest to justify themselves usually know exactly when they've crossed a line internally. I looked upward automatically. And there it was. Tiny black monitor mounted near the ceiling. One steady red light blinking quietly. Recording all of it. Carol looked at me once. Didn't speak. Didn't interfere. She simply stepped backward and let me decide what happened next. Interesting thing about decent people. They recognize the exact moment someone deserves control over their own story again. I pushed the door open slowly. Diane jerked upright immediately beside the bed. Pen still in her hand. Folder open across the blanket. Colored tabs sticking out from the paperwork like little flags. Francis. Her voice climbed half an octave instantly. You came. Not relief. Calculation. Huge difference. Interesting, honestly. Because manipulative people always sound interrupted once witnesses appear unexpectedly. I set the untouched coffee onto the side table carefully. Then walked directly to my father. Not the paperwork. Not Diane. Him. Interesting thing about dying people. They notice immediately who approaches them like a person versus a problem. Dad looked impossibly small against the white sheets. Cheekbones sharp. Skin almost translucent beneath the hospital lighting. And honestly? That image still hurts more than the betrayal. Because no matter how complicated families become, watching a parent disappear physically feels unbearably simple. His eyes found mine slowly. Focused. Lost focus. Then found me again. Hi, Dad. My voice nearly failed on the second word. It's Franny. Tiny squeeze against my fingers. Barely there. Still real. Interesting thing about love. Sometimes it survives strongest exactly when language no longer can. Diane recovered quickly. Of course she did. He wants to get his affairs organized. She smoothed the blanket unnecessarily. Classic nervous motion. Interesting, honestly. Because liars touch objects constantly once their hands no longer know where to go. At midnight? He's lucid. That word landed hard. Lucid. Interesting thing about legal terminology. People abusing vulnerable adults learn the important vocabulary surprisingly fast. I looked directly at my father. His eyes drifted toward the ceiling. Then toward the folder. Then away completely. Anyone with functioning eyesight could see the truth immediately. He wasn't lucid. He was exhausted. Medicated. Fading. Interesting, honestly. Because predators depend heavily on everyone pretending not to notice obvious things out loud. I picked up the top page carefully. Deed transfer. Property reassignment. Power modifications. The kind of paperwork that permanently rearranges families after funerals. Interesting thing about probate disputes. They usually begin long before anyone dies officially. Dad. I leaned closer gently. Do you want to sign anything tonight? Silence. Long silence. Then finally. His lips moved weakly. Franny. Just my name. Nothing else. Like someone reaching toward shore through dark water. Diane stepped forward immediately. He told me already what he wants. Interesting, honestly. Because controlling people always start translating vulnerable adults once direct answers stop cooperating. Then it can wait until morning. My voice stayed calm. Cold calm. The kind built from 10 years watching families self-destruct professionally. When his actual attorney is present. That hit. I watched it hit. Real attorney. Not the opportunistic stranger Garrett found willing to push paperwork through hospice rooms. Interesting thing about guilt. Sometimes it flashes visibly across someone's face before they manage to hide it again. For 1 second, Diane stopped looking like a grieving wife. And started looking like someone watching a financial calculation collapse unexpectedly. Then Carol stepped quietly into the room behind me. It's time for Mr. Wheeler to rest. Professional voice. Final voice. No room for argument inside it. Interesting, honestly. Because experienced nurses know exactly when to end conversations before damage becomes irreversible. Diane stared at me another long second. Then capped the pen sharply. Too sharply. And gathered the paperwork into the folder against her chest. No documents got signed that night. Not one. She finally left around midnight. Perfume lingering faintly after the door closed behind her. I stayed. Not because I wanted control. Because for the first time in months, my father actually had someone in the room not asking him for anything. Interesting thing about real love. It becomes incredibly quiet near the end. I pulled the vinyl chair beside the bed. Held his hand. Listened to the 4-pump tick softly in the dark. And above us, the tiny red camera light kept blinking patiently. Watching the truth survived. No documents got signed that night. Not one. Interesting thing about interrupted manipulation. Once someone blocks the process publicly, everyone suddenly becomes aware a process existed in the first place. Diane left room 214 at 12:03 a.m. Folder pressed tightly against her chest. Perfume lingering faintly after the door closed behind her. And honestly, that silence afterward felt heavier than the confrontation itself. Interesting thing about hospice rooms. They become brutally honest once the performing stops. My father slept most of the night. Morphine drifting him in and out of consciousness like tides. Machines humming softly beside the bed. Rain tapping against the third-floor windows. And above us, the tiny red recording light kept blinking patiently near the ceiling. Watching everything. Interesting, honestly. Because truth survives surprisingly often through ordinary technology people forget exists. Around 2 a.m. Dad woke briefly. Eyes unfocused at first. Then slowly finding mine beside the bed. Franny? I'm here. Tiny pause. You drove? I almost laughed. Not because it felt funny. Because dying parents somehow remain parents even while disappearing. Interesting thing about love. Sometimes concern survives longer than memory. 14 hours. His mouth twitched weakly. That's expensive gas. There he was. For 3 seconds? My actual father returned completely. Interesting honestly. Because grief becomes unbearable precisely when clarity reappears briefly before vanishing again. Then his expression changed. Small shift. Huge fear. The papers. Barely audible. I leaned closer immediately. You don't need to sign anything. His breathing shook once. She said. Pause. You'd lose everything. Interesting thing about manipulation. It almost always relies on fear first. Not greed. Fear. I looked toward the closed door carefully. Then back at him. What exactly did she tell you? His eyelids fluttered heavily. Company. Pause. Taxes. Another pause. Probate mess. Interesting honestly. Because complicated lies work best on exhausted people who no longer have energy to verify details. She said if I didn't transfer things now. His breathing hitched weakly. They'd freeze everything. There it was. Urgency. Classic coercion structure. Interesting thing about financial predators. They manufacture emergencies because scared people stop asking questions. Dad. I squeezed his hand carefully. That isn't true. Silence. Long silence. Then finally. His eyes filled slightly. Not dramatic tears. Just exhaustion leaking outward. Interesting honestly. Because old men who spent lifetimes staying strong often grieve quietly near the end. I got tired, Franny. That sentence nearly broke me completely. Not because he sounded weak. Because he sounded ashamed. Interesting thing about good fathers. They apologize for collapsing even while dying. You don't have to handle this anymore. I should have called you sooner. Another tiny pause. She said you were busy. Interesting honestly. Because isolation always works by rewriting absence as indifference. I sat there holding his hand while years rearranged themselves painfully inside my head. The unanswered calls. The cancelled visits. The sudden distance. Not random. Managed. Carefully managed. Interesting thing about controlling people. They rarely sever relationships directly. They filter them slowly until connection weakens naturally. Dad drifted asleep again before sunrise. I never moved from the chair. And sometime around 5:30, Carol returned carrying stale coffee and a legal pad. Interesting thing about experienced nurses. They recognize investigations before families do. You should document everything, she said quietly. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Professional. Huge difference. I stared at the legal pad. Then at the blinking camera light above us. Can hospice access those recordings? Carol nodded once. Administration can preserve them. Pause. If requested properly. Interesting honestly. Because systems protect truth surprisingly well once the right people decide to use them correctly. By morning, Diane returned with Garrett. Her son. 42. Commercial real estate broker. Perfect teeth. Expensive watch. The kind of man who shook hands like negotiations started before introductions. Interesting thing about certain men. You can tell immediately whether they view vulnerable people emotionally or financially first. Garrett stopped cold seeing me beside the bed. Tiny hesitation. Tiny calculation. Huge tell. Francis. Not warm. Not hostile. Strategic. Interesting honestly. Because manipulative families always pivot tone depending on who might become a witness later. Diane recovered faster. Raymond had a difficult night. Not Dad. Not your father. Raymond. Interesting thing about emotional distancing. People preparing for financial conflict often start using formal names unconsciously. I stood slowly. He won't be signing anything. Garrett smiled immediately. Corporate smile. Empty smile. Nobody's pressuring him. Interesting honestly. Because innocent people rarely deny accusations nobody officially made yet. I looked directly at the folder under Diane's arm. Same colored tabs. Same documents. Still waiting. He needs rest. Diane's jaw tightened slightly. We're simply trying to honor his wishes. There it was. The sentence every inheritance manipulator uses eventually. Interesting thing about wishes. Dead and dying people develop remarkably convenient wishes once money enters the room. What attorney drafted the transfer documents? Garrett answered instantly. Family counsel. Name withheld. Another tell. Interesting honestly. Because legitimate attorneys rarely become mysterious during ordinary estate planning. I crossed my arms calmly. I'd like copies. Silence. Tiny silence. Huge problem. Diane looked toward Garrett. Garrett looked toward Diane. And right there. The entire dynamic exposed itself. Interesting thing about conspiracies. They fall apart fastest once participants must improvise publicly. We'll provide everything appropriately, Garrett said carefully. Translation. They needed time. That's when Dad woke again. Eyes drifting slowly toward the voices. Then toward Diane. Interesting honestly. Because fear changes dying people physically once they recognize pressure entering the room again. Raymond, Diane said brightly. Francis is upset about the paperwork. Upset. Not concerned. Not protective. Upset. Interesting thing about manipulators. They emotionally reframe resistance to make themselves appear reasonable. Dad stared weakly at the folder. Then toward me. And finally whispered. No more papers. Silence. Real silence. Because suddenly, the vulnerable man in the bed had spoken clearly enough for everyone. Interesting honestly. Because truth becomes devastating once the person being controlled finally says it out loud themselves. Garrett recovered first. Raymond's exhausted. No, Carol said from the doorway quietly. He's clear. Interesting thing about veteran nurses. They become terrifying once they decide someone vulnerable needs protecting. Nobody spoke after that. Not Garrett. Not Diane. Even the 4-pump suddenly sounded louder. Tick. 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 Like the room itself had started counting down something inevitable. Then Dad lifted one trembling hand weakly toward me. Drawer. I leaned closer immediately. What drawer? Truck keys. Pause. Bottom. Interesting honestly. Because dying fathers often communicate in fragments that only daughters patient enough to listen can assemble later. Diane stepped forward instantly. He's confused. No, Dad whispered again. This time stronger. Franny knows. That sentence changed Diane's face completely. For half a second, real panic appeared. Not grief. Not stress. Panic. Interesting thing about controlling people. They become terrified the moment hidden information might still exist outside their control, for half a second? Real panic crossed Diane's face. Not grief. Not stress. Panic. Interesting thing about manipulative people. They become terrified the moment hidden information might still exist outside their control. Raymond needs rest, Diane said quickly. Too quickly. Garrett stepped beside her immediately. Protective formation. Like two people instinctively shielding a collapsing plan. Interesting, honestly. Because guilt reorganizes body language before words catch up. Dad kept staring at me. Eyes cloudy from medication. Still focused enough to mean something. Truck, he whispered again. Pause. Bottom drawer. Then his eyes closed. Exhaustion pulling him under completely this time. Interesting thing about dying conversations. Sometimes the final important instructions arrive fragmented because the body no longer has strength for complete explanations. Diane moved toward the bed immediately. Checking blankets that didn't need checking. Adjusting pillows already straight. The kind of frantic caregiving people perform when they need witnesses remembering them as compassionate afterward. Interesting, honestly. Because performance intensifies once manipulation becomes visible publicly. I looked toward Carol. Carol looked toward me. No words needed. She had seen enough. So had I. Garrett cleared his throat softly. We should all take a breath. Interesting phrase. Because people losing control always ask for calm the second evidence starts surfacing. I agree. I picked